My name is Lynne Sebastian. I'm a happily retired person. After more than 30 years in the field of historic preservation and the field of archaeology, and I live in Corrales, New Mexico, in a beautiful place with sunshine all the time, and my husband and I are really enjoying our retirement years. Well, when I was an undergraduate, I took a class on the archaeology of Peru to fill a requirement, and I told my mother and my father that I was interested in being an archaeologist. I thought that would be a really neat thing to do, and my mother told me, "You'll never be able to get a job." She said, "If you want to do this, finish your undergraduate degree, get a teaching certificate, and you'll always be able to get a job, and then if you decide you want to try this archaeology thing, you'll have something to fall back on." So I graduated from college in 1969 with a teaching certificate in secondary education and English. And it was the only teacher surplus we've ever had in this country, and I couldn't get a job. Listening to your mother is always a good thing to do. So I worked as a secretary for a while at the University of Michigan, which is where I was, and then I got a chance to apply for an editing job, and I got an editing job at the Museum of Anthropology at the University of Michigan, and for a number of years I was their editor, and then I moved to Utah. My ex-husband was in the military, so I moved on to editing again at the University of Utah. Editing archaeological publications, and then Dr. Jeremy Sabloff came there as a professor, and he had the, the misfortune to be chosen as the editor of American Antiquity, and he asked me to be his copy editor. And when I started editing things other than site reports, which is mostly what I'd been editing all those years, I found out there was a lot of cool stuff in archaeology. And I decided that I was going to follow through with what I wanted to do. So I was 30 years old. I went to field school to see if I could physically take it, survived it, barely, and switched into archaeology and went on to get a Ph.D. in anthropology at the University of New Mexico. I'm working for Jennings as his editor, and I tell him that I've decided that I want to go back to school and get my degree in archaeology, or anthropology. And he looked at me and said I was just a bored housewife who was looking for something to do. And he was going to flunk me out of the program at Utah. So I started taking classes. I started getting straight A's, including in his class. I went to field school. I got a really good grade at field school. And as was always the case with the old man, once you proved to him that you could do it, he was on your side completely. I mean, if you screwed something up, it took you forever to get back into the point where he trusted you. But once he did, there could be no one more supportive. If you needed money, you needed permission to dig somewhere, you needed whatever it was. And so one of the sad things to me, because Jennings was a past president of the SAA, one of the sad things to me was that he didn't live to see me be president of the SAA. Not, as people would think, because I wanted to, thumb my nose at him, but because he would have been tickled to death. Because I would have said from the podium when I took over as president that story about Jennings telling me he was going to flunk me out of the program, and he would have laughed louder than anybody else. Well, I became an SAA member as soon as I switched into archaeology. It was pointed out to me that it was expected of an archaeologist to be a member of the SAA, so I'd been a member for a long time. And then later, a little later in my career, I was the State Historic Preservation Officer in New Mexico. And that gave me a certain amount of visibility, I guess. I don't know exactly how this happened, but I was asked to run for secretary of the SAA. And I did, being certain that the person I was running against was going to win. And unfortunately, no. Fortunately for me, I won. And I had a wonderful time being secretary-elect and secretary. Really enjoyed it, met so many wonderful people. And so a couple of years later, I was asked to run for president. And by this time, I knew exactly how big a job I was setting myself up for, but I went ahead and said yes anyway. And was hugely honored to be president of SAA. from the beginning of the work that I did in archaeology, I was really interested in social organization. In fact, that's what really sucked me in. When I found out that you didn't just have to describe pottery and bones and stones, but that you could think about things like political organization and social organization. I mean, it was the Hill and Longacre New Archaeology era when I got into this, and it was this illumination to me. So I was looking for an opportunity to do research on the origins of social and political complexity. I mean, to me, the most interesting thing was, how did we get from a system where nobody was in charge, except, you know, the head of the family, to a culture where somebody was in charge, where there was a role for a leader? How do you do that? How do you warrant that to the people that you live with? How do you not get in trouble for, you know, putting yourself forward in an egalitarian society? And I was on the Dolores archaeological project back in the early 80s, and saw, you know, sort of firsthand what that initial steps toward complexity looked like. And that really cemented it for me. That's what I wanted to do. I ended up not being able to do my dissertation work on Dolores for a variety of reasons, but I was at the University of New Mexico, and I worked with Jim Judge on Chaco, you know, which is another great example of going from a system where nobody's in charge to where people are big time in charge. So I worked at the Office of Contract Archaeology at the University of New Mexico for, I think, 8 years, certainly the whole time I was getting my Ph.D. And, or I was working on toward my Ph.D. And then my older stepson started college. Well, my husband and I were both contract archaeologists, which meant we had no sick leave, we had no health insurance, we had no benefits of any sort. And I said, someone in this family needs to get a real job. So I got the offer from the husband of a woman that I've been doing some research work for to be the deputy state historic preservation officer. And I didn't know much about it. I mean, I was doing the field work that led to compliance with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, but it was a giant black box to me, like it is to all contract archaeologists. You know, you do the work in the field, you write a report, you send it in. People do things to it and you don't know what, and sometimes it comes back with comments and sometimes it comes back okay. So I entered into the black box. In 1966, 50 years ago today, or not today, 50 years ago in October, the Congress passed the National Historic Preservation Act. And one of the things that the Preservation Act requires is that when federal agencies are going to approve or fund or license or carry out a project, they have to consider the potential effects on historic properties, which includes archaeological sites as well as buildings and, you know, structures, that kind of thing. And so for every federal undertaking, of which there are thousands and thousands in the country every year, the agency has to decide whether that project will affect a historic property. And the whole process is about balancing preservation and development. That we all want clean air and clean water and good roads and all the trappings of modern life, but we don't want to give up our entire heritage. And so the notion of the NHPA, and specifically of Section 106 of the NHPA, is that the federal agency has to stop and think, how can we balance preservation and development in the public interest? And that's the third leg of the stool. And so it's a consultative process. It involves citizen groups, it involves tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations, it involves the applicant. If it's a guy who wants to build a pipeline or whatever, they have a seat at the table for the consultations, and the interests of the people of every state are represented by their state historic preservation officer, which is a job that's created in federal law, but is appointed and managed at the state level. So the SHPO, or the SHPO staff, reviews every one of those undertakings, and has the voice of the people of the state in that decision-making process at the federal level. I found myself commuting to Santa Fe, which is 70 miles from Albuquerque, where I lived, every day for 11 years. And I learned on the job and learned very fast. And it was hard at first. There was another contract archaeology office in the same building where my office was, the Museum of New Mexico's archaeologists. And late on beautiful afternoons, I would see them coming in from the field with their equipment and their boxes of artifacts. And I would press my face against the glass like a starving child and go, I could be doing field work. But I really felt like every day in that job, I made a difference. And some days it was a little tiny difference, and some days it was a really big difference. But every day I was doing something that made a difference. And so slowly, over the course of several years, I got really drawn into historic preservation and became more and more involved in it. And I was the deputy for, I think, 8 years, and I was concurrently the state archaeologist for that period. And then I was offered the job of being the state historic preservation officer, which was a great honor and a great mistake on my part. It's a very political office, and you are an exempt employee, which means you can be fired at will. You're not part of the state civil service. Turned out that was exactly what happened to me. And the really annoying part of this is, during the course of my time at SHPO, there were times it had been like the murder on the Orient Express. There would have been so many suspects of, what it was that I got fired over, because they didn't tell me. But at that particular time, there was nothing going on that anybody should have been that mad about. And yet, the governor, through an intermediary, asked for my resignation, and I didn't have a choice but to do it. And to this day, I still don't know what I got fired over. Someone who apparently had a misperception of what we had done, because at that point, like I say, there wasn't anything that we had done that anyone should be angry about, thought that we had done him in, or her in some way, had the governor's ear, went to the governor and said, I want that person out. And it was a very stressful time in the governor's office. It was one of those perfect storms. There was a prison riot, and they were up all night over at the Roundhouse, as we call our capital, for like 3 nights, dealing with the prison riot, and people had died. And so I'm sure he was very stressed. And his chief of staff, who I had always worked with, when there was any problem, he would call me over and we would figure out what to do. He was out of town. And so it really was the perfect storm. And I'm sure that it was a mistake, because there was nobody who should have been that mad about anything that we had done at that period. Well, there I was, 52 years old, and starting over again. So I started over again when I was 30, and then I started over again 8 years later when I moved out of field archaeology and into historic preservation. And then at 52 years old, I found myself out of a job and needing to start over for yet another time. I always tell young people, it's good to have a plan for your life. It's really important to have a plan for your life. Don't expect any of the things that you plan to actually happen, because plans are what you do while you're waiting for life to happen to you. That certainly has been the case for me. So I wept a lot and worried a lot. We had just built a new house. And I had 2 wonderful friends who had been colleagues who I admired for years, both of whom offered me a job. And you actually know them both, I'm sure, because it was Bill Doley from Desert Archaeology and Jeff Alshel from Statistical Research. And they offered me jobs on the same day. And it was one of the hardest decisions I ever made. Actually, a lot of people called and offered me a job right after I got fired, but they all wanted me to run contract offices for them. One of the big multi-state firms would ask me to open an office for them in Albuquerque. And that wasn't my skill set. I knew that. I mean, that's my husband's skill set. That's not mine. It was hard to turn those jobs down because I was 52 years old and out of a job. But I knew that that wasn't right. But Bill and Jeff both offered me really interesting jobs that were much more in my skill set. I ended up deciding to go with statistical research with Jeff Alshel. in part because what he was wanting me to do was to be part of developing a not-for-profit. You know, statistical research is a for-profit company, but he and Debbie, his wife, had long thought that there were a lot of things that needed to be done in the world of historic preservation that were better done in a not-for-profit environment. And so he wanted me to be part of starting the SRI, what became the SRI Foundation. And it resonated with some of the things that I really wanted to do. And I have been so blessed by that decision because, as it turned out, as we got the foundation started, it enabled me to use all of the skills that I developed at SHPO that I really valued, and didn't make me use any of the skills that I really didn't like when I was doing that job. You know, I never had to go to another state legislature budget hearing in the rest of my life. But I got to do what I love to do at SHPO, which is to look at that balance thing. You know, here's this guy who wants to build his pipeline, and here's this tribe that has a place of really important significance to them. And here are these archaeological sites that are going to be affected. And here is this community that really wants the jobs from the pipeline. And here is, you know, and so I sit down at the table with all of these people who have all of these wishes for what the balance between preservation and development should look like. Helping them find that point of balance and making that happen is the absolute best job in the world for me. I mean, I think I was a pretty decent archaeologist, but I am better at what I ended up doing than I was as an archaeologist, and I know that. I mean, this is a skill set that just really works for me. And so I've made a big difference in a lot of projects and made sure that they came out balanced. I've failed on some, you know, you do. But the decision to go with statistical research sent my career in a direction that was really good for me. The thing I started out to do was to do training, to do continuing professional education training on compliance with Section 106 and the National Environmental Policy Act and all the things that people had to do. And it was a great opportunity to go to federal agencies, sit down with their folks, and, you know, teach them my way of doing Section 106, you know, the balanced way, the creative way, or to do this with contractors, you know, archaeological contractors, cultural resource management contractors. So that was really fun, and I up until I retired, I still did a lot of that, and every once in a while, if they need me to, will go and teach a class now, because I enjoy it. I'm a born performer and a born teacher. And I really enjoy the classes, that people enjoy my classes, and it's a lot of energy and fun. But we also began doing best practices studies, you know, looking at people all around the country and how they dealt with particular issues, so that people had some models or some ideas. You know, you hit this brick wall and think, no, nobody in the world has ever dealt with this. Well, yeah, they have. And here's, you know, 8 examples of what other states have done, kind of thing. So those are fun. So kind of by accident, began to do technical assistance to either federal agencies or state agencies or private applicants, you know, mining companies, pipeline companies, mostly mining. I ended up doing a lot of work with mining companies who had gotten sort of stuck crossways in the Section 106 process and needed, you know, somebody on their side who understood how the process worked to make sure that they had their voices heard, that they got a fair deal, that they, you know, that things worked out for them. And my requirement always was, when attorneys called me and asked me to help these folks, you have to prove to me that your client is innocent. You know, I won't work for people who are trying to get out of doing historic preservation compliance. But if they honestly and truly are trying to do it and they're getting, frankly, jerked around by one of the other players, whether it's a federal agency or it's a SHPO or it's the tribe or whoever, you know, I will come in and I will try to help you get a fair deal. And that's the only promise I make you. And it turned out that I actually like doing expert witness work. There's something wrong with people who like to do that, because it's like taking orals. for days. You know, you've got this guy, the attorney on the other side, whatever the other side is, in your face, you know, saying, and you have to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, and do it in a way that doesn't damage your client's case. It's very challenging. I couldn't do it anymore. I'm not fast enough mentally. But I had a strange liking for it. I was editing for Dr. Jennings, and you know, people who never met the man can't really picture what life was like with the man that we called the Dark Lord. I never called him that, and we certainly never called him that to his face, but he was a larger-than-life character. I mean, he was big, he was strong, he was irascible, he was smart, I mean, really smart, and he was the absolutely best field archaeologist I ever saw in my life. If he didn't think much of new archaeology, of course, because he was a culture historian. And you know, he was really grumpy about all of us getting all into this new archaeology stuff. But the day that he told me that there was a mistake in the fieldwork for one of the classic new archaeology studies, that the researcher in question had misinterpreted the stratigraphy, I never believed that study again. If the old man said that he screwed up the stratigraphy, he screwed up the stratigraphy. So in terms of fieldwork, you know, his approach to things, the way he dug sites, I learned so much from that. And also from my husband, who was a Jennings student, and I worked for my husband, Pat Hogan, in the field for years. And he had learned so much from Jennings, and I learned so much from him. So it really passed down. Jerry Sabloff was the chairman of my committee for a while at New Mexico until he left New Mexico. And I like Jerry very much, and I still really admire his work. The person who really influenced me the most at New Mexico was Jim Judge. You know, Jim Judge was a great underrated archaeologist. I mean, he was brilliant and self-effacing as a teacher. And he was a fine field archaeologist as well, and he ran the Chaco Project, which, you know, if he hadn't been a Marine, I don't think he would have been tough enough to do, because it was a very difficult process. So Jim was a real influence on me as well. And I guess archaeologically speaking, I mean, I have heroes, you know, A.V. Kidder. If I could meet one of the long-gone archaeologists, it would be Kidder in a minute. I just admire him. I admire J.O. Brew very much. He was so far ahead of his time. If you read Alkali Ridge and things like that, I admired him. As I got into historic preservation, Hester Davis and Bob McGimsey became my heroes. They were both very dear to me. I actually got to work with Hester a fair amount, and I still miss them. And the other person I really need to mention is Bill Leip. You know, Bill has been a friend, he's been a mentor, he's been a colleague. He is one of the finest archaeologists and has one of the best minds that I know. And he still knows everything and reads everything. And you know, you ask Bill for advice about something and you get a 20-page bibliography of stuff he thinks you ought to read, and he's read it all. So he's pretty impressive as well. Well, there's John Kantner. When I was at SHPO, when I finished my Ph.D. dissertation, I was fortunate enough to have it published by the Cambridge University Press. And one day I got this call from this young man who said, I read your book and I'm really excited about it, and it's just exactly what I want to do for my master's thesis, and you know, can I come and talk to you, because my folks live in Santa Fe. And I said, well, okay. And so I mentioned this to staff. So they're all going, oh, Lynn has a groupie. And so the day he came, he was very young, and he had this, you know, spiky punk haircut and an earring in one ear. And he comes down the hall, and I can see behind him all the staff kind of leaning out to peek and see what my groupie looks like. Turned out John was, you know, 3 times as smart as I am, and took what I did and ran with it in ways that I couldn't have even come close. And we have been friends and colleagues ever since. As a historic preservation professional, I know that there are many people who think that I'm, you know, their role model and their hero, and I'm very outspoken, and I've published a lot on, stop doing this nonsense and start doing things sensibly. As Bill Leip and I, in a book that we put together with a bunch of people, we said the whole way to solve doing better cultural resource management archaeology comes down to SDSS squared. Stop doing stupid stuff, start doing smart stuff. And I've written heavily on that, and I'm constantly being met by agency and SHPO people and people in the CRM world who say that I've really had an influence on them, but I couldn't really describe myself as a mentor. Actually, I would like to back up and say just a couple words about my colleagues. We've talked about mentors and mentees. I have the very best colleagues that it's possible to imagine. The executive director of the foundation, Terry Klein, and I have formed this incredible partnership, and it was because of him that the foundation has become what it is. Terry is the center of what we do, and he was a good archaeologist. Years ago, he was a historical archaeologist, and everyone tells me he's a good archaeologist, but he is a fabulous person. Anyway, Terry is has a wonderful mind for cultural resource management. He's seen it from every possible angle. He was the vice president of a major firm, a nationwide firm. He was their cultural vice president. He's done the field work. He's done the work on Capitol Hill. He's done everything, and so it's been an honor to work with Terry, and the most fun. Okay, so I talked about Terry. I also would like to mention David Cushman, who was my deputy when I was the SHPO. He was my deputy SHPO and was at Pima County for years as an archaeologist, and then came to the foundation. And the three of us, Terry and David and I, really are kind of the center of the foundation. And it's been an honor, an unbelievable honor to work with them every day. Several years ago, President Obama appointed me to be a member of the Federal Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And next to being president of SAA, that was one of the major honors of my life. The Advisory Council is sort of the other party in the Section 106 process. They are the ones who write the regulations for it. They are the ones who have the final say on agreement documents and various things. And serving on a federal advisory group was a fascinating experience. And so I should mention that as well, as another sort of milestone in my career. Well, they're the ones that aren't our fault and the ones that are our fault. The ones that aren't our fault is the political situation that we are in and always in. I mean, I went through the Reagan years when they tried to zero out the Historic Preservation Fund. We're in an anti-regulatory period again, and we've been there before. So there are always those pressures that are going to come down on us, and everybody worries about those. We have it within our power to fight back against these forces of darkness and evil, as people like to view these political problems that we run into. But we're our own worst enemy sometimes, in part because we don't pursue the balance of Section 106 and the NEPA process. I mean, if some development industry person is doing their very best to try to do what's right for the historic resources and the archaeological sites, and they're getting into more and more and more of a morass that never ends, that they're asked to do more, there's delays, there's all of these things happening to them. It's no wonder that they become upset and unhappy and think that the process isn't working, because the process isn't working. This is supposed to go through a balancing process, through the consultation process, and then the federal agency is supposed to make a decision and move on with the project. And when that doesn't happen, and we contribute to that, we're putting the whole legal underpinning of the majority of the archaeology that we do in this country every year at risk. And so we're our own worst enemy in that way. The other way, and this is my favorite hobby horse, the other way that we're our own worst enemy is that we are not interacting with the public the way that we should. It's their money. They're paying millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, one way or another, either directly through taxes or through pass-through costs from development industries, to have all this archaeology done. What are they getting back? What are they getting back from us? I mean, every one of us has a responsibility to share with them the wonder of the past and the amazing experience of touching lives of people who lived so long ago, to tell them the big stories, the exciting stories. They know that the Indians ate corn, okay? If that's all we're finding out and that's all we're sharing with the public, then we're not doing this right. And the other thing is, archaeologists are really good at data. They gather data by the truckloads. They're really good at information, at taking those data and developing an understanding of the lithic technology of this such and such tribe in South America. They're not good at generating knowledge, at really developing an understanding of what life was like in the past. That's a synthetic process. And we don't have time, we don't have money, we don't have the skills. We have lots of excuses, but until we start generating that kind of high-level knowledge, we can't either give back to the public the kind of stories that we ought to be telling them, and we can't make a difference in terms of getting the policymakers to understand what archaeology has to tell them. We're in the middle of a climate change here, or at least a lot of people think so. Climate changes have happened in the past. Archaeology has the data and has the time perspective. What we need is a process for taking that, turning it into valuable understandings about how previous cultures dealt with it, what worked, what didn't, and finding a mechanism for getting that to policymakers. So I guess if I had to answer the question, what are my hopes for the future? My hopes for the future are that archaeologists learn to write in plain English again. That would be number one, because that's the biggest bar to our understanding of what what our colleagues are doing, at least my understanding. I open a journal and I see all of this language that I don't know what those words mean. Everybody comes up with these jargon phrases. And of course, it's the biggest bar standing between us and the public. So number one wish is archaeologists would learn to write in plain English again. Number two wish is that archaeologists would make more of an effort to not just learn about the archaeological record, but to take what we learn about the archaeological record and turn it into an understanding of what life was like in the past. And number three is that the cultural resource management world, everybody in it, every single player, the SHPOs, the tribes, the local governments, the federal agencies, the consultants, everybody would rededicate themselves to the balance between preservation and development. If we do that, we can make all of the modern development that we all need and want to have happen, and we can do it in a way that has the least effect and sometimes even beneficial effects on the preservation of our heritage.